Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to have you aboard today. We're happy to welcome Jeff Luse to the program. Jeff, this is your first time on the show. Let's, first of all, find out just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me, Brian. I am a policy assistant for the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, or C3 Solutions, as we like to call ourselves. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that's focused on advancing free market solutions to energy, and environment, and different climate challenges.
All right. Well, I'm glad to have you on the show. We've got a great topic to discuss. This is an article that you had written for townhall.com. Build Back Better will fail to reach climate goals. And I got to say, Jeff, I know that the Democrats in Congress have been working very, very hard to get that funding, or that Build Back Better infrastructure bill passed. Where do they stand on this? I've kind of I thought it was maybe on the back burner, if not off the stove entirely. But it sounds like they're not going to give up. Where does this bill stand?
Sure. Yeah. As of now, it is, in a sense, off the stove. It wasn't mentioned in President Biden's State of the Union address. And after the State of the Union speech, Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, who's the lone holdout on the bill, he said, and I quote, "Nothing's changed." So it is looking like the prospects of passing Build Back Better as a $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion piece of legislation, it looks like that's pretty much dead. Although Senate Leader Chuck Schumer did write in a Dear Colleague letter today that Democrats later this week during their retreat, they may start renewing talks about reconciliation and passing smaller packages with climate and energy.
Okay, and let's talk climate change. I mean, energy is one thing. I think we're all kind of feeling at the pump right now what rising energy costs are doing to us. But talk to me about climate, and what exactly are the Democrats who are pushing this bill promoting? Do they believe we can spend our way into changing the global climate?
It sure seems that way, yeah. So the climate provisions that were included in the original legislation that passed the House but haven't passed the Senate included $200 billion for EV tax credits, which that's definitely noble. We should probably want more EVs on the road so long as it's driven by consumer choice. But 90% of these tax credits go to the highest income earners. And then there was also $60 billion included for targeted wind and solar tax credits, which again, we should be all for expanding renewable energy in the United States so long as it's driven primarily by market forces.
When you refer to solar and wind as mature energy technologies, help me understand what that means. They've been around long enough that people know that they work. It's not like, oh, we're experimenting with something new.
Sure, yeah. What I meant by that is that the price comparison of solar and wind has fallen dramatically. It's now cost comparable with fossil fuels, which is another source of energy that receives subsidies that probably shouldn't have it. Both fossil fuels and renewables are mature at this point, and the subsidies that the federal government's funding are long outdated and are really harmful to emerging technologies that don't receive the same preferential treatment in the tax code.
Interesting. By the way, I'm with you. I'm on board with the idea that the free market actually would provide much more incentive for people who are looking to reduce their carbon footprint, and best of all, they do it voluntarily. I don't know. I don't know if I want to empower the same people who have kind of choked our energy production. It sounds like this kind of spending would essentially give them job security or benefit them. Do special interests benefit from this proposed funding as well?
Yeah, special interests definitely do. And I think you're starting to see a shift also in the Biden administration with focusing on union-specific manufacturers. There were provisions that included, additional benefits for union-specific EV manufacturers such as GM and Ford, excluding Tesla, who isn't union but is definitely one of the leaders in the industry. And then you're also seeing with wind and solar, you're seeing protectionist measures taken in favor of domestic manufacturers, which ultimately actually impact consumers. So you're seeing with solar tariffs, The tariffs that have been imposed on foreign solar companies, or solar production, I should say, have actually increased costs for consumers and decreased investments for solar energy in the United States.
What kind of talk do you hear, if any, about the next generation nuclear reactors?
Yeah, so there's been funding at the Department of Energy. There's also been private sector involvement, such as Bill Gates' TerraPower, that's planning on building a small modular reactor on top of a retired coal plant in Wyoming. And production for that's supposed to start around 2028 about. So there's definitely a lot of emerging technologies with small modular reactors that are really exciting. They negate some of the safety concerns that the traditional fission reactors that we have now. Although the safety concerns, I would say, are unwarranted. Nuclear is a very safe energy option. But we're starting to see more and more companies and startups pursue small modular reactors, although we are seeing the implementation slow down a bit by outdated regulations. So the current nuclear regulations are very prescriptive instead of performance-based. So they favor older fission reactors, although even then it takes years to site and permit and get everything done. So I think reforming nuclear regulations would enable entrepreneurs and companies to invest more and get more of these next generation nuclear reactors up on site.
I don't think most people would object to finding alternatives to fossil fuels, but I have to ask you, Jeff, is it realistic what is being proposed in terms of we're trying to reverse climate change? Does this mean that the Democrats and those who are working with them in the environmental lobby are trying to essentially turn their backs on fossil fuels as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so I think maybe they had intended to do that. I think we're seeing the repercussions of that in Ukraine. With Germany phasing out all nuclear and starting to push for all renewables, which again, we should definitely favor diversity in an energy portfolio, so long as it's driven by consumers. But yeah, you saw Germany phase out all coal and nuclear, push to renewables, but then as a baseload fuel source, they had to import Russian natural gas, which of course Putin weaponized to fund his invasion of Ukraine. So I think we're starting to see a bit more of energy realism, especially in Europe, with Germany starting to open up or at least extend some of their nuclear power plants. And you're also starting to see the EU recognize natural gas as a green investment. So I think what we need to do now in the United States is look for ways to increase production, such as opening up or permitting the Keystone Pipeline, for example, or reducing regulations such as the Jones Act, which impose a lot of costs for transportation of natural gas and oil in the United States, which can honestly make it more cost competitive to import it from Russia.
So I have to ask this, and I guess it's probably because I'm a skeptic who loves to drive a gas car and barbecue and otherwise, to create greenhouse gases. But I have to wonder if first of all, if the proposals on the part of those Democrats who want to, reverse climate change, if that's even something that can be accomplished, and secondly, is it something that can be accomplished without inserting more government into every aspect of our lives?
Sure. Yeah. As far as reversing climate change, that's a very global problem. Currently, the United States emits about 14% of total global emissions. China is right around 29%. So if we really want to reverse climate change, which I think is doable, it's doable to get to net zero at least. We really have to focus on international markets and emerging markets where the majority of future emissions will come from. And in terms of energy production, I think American fossil fuels can play a really key role in that. So, for example, just having Europe rely on American LNG versus Russian LNG would be a great environmental move, a great economic move.
Wow. I think the amount of spending that we saw in response to the coronavirus pandemic, in response to stimulus, and now this is simply mind-blowing. And at any point, is there anybody urging caution besides Manchin and who was it, Sinema?
Yeah, I mean, several Senate Republicans are as well. I think that's definitely smart. Inflation plays a key role in daily lives. It also plays a key role in financing the energy transition. You know, higher inflation costs make production costs higher, makes it less economically viable to transition to lower carbon energy sources. So I think it's definitely an important task that we reduce inflation and look towards private sector involvement.
We are talking with Jeff Luse. He is a Young Voices contributor and policy assistant to the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, or C3 Solutions. Where can they find you on social media?
Sure, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Not much of a Twitter or Instagram buff, but if you want to follow C3 Solutions on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, it's at C3 Solutions News. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we're very happy to welcome Young Voices contributor Roy Matthews to the program. Roy, this is your first time on board with us, but we'd love to know just a little bit more about you and what you do.
Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me. So I'm currently a public policy associate at the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure, which is a think tank that focuses on fostering innovative solutions to climate, transportation, energy, and infrastructure-related public policy issues. We do research and educational content for everyone from policymakers to industry experts to just the general public. And in my spare time, I like to write, research, and read all I can about what I think is the most interesting part of the world, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the wider post-Soviet space.
Well, it's certainly getting more interesting even as we speak. And I'm looking at a very timely article that you penned for realclearworld.com. The CSTO looks out for its members, so must Nato. And I'll admit, I'm quite familiar with Nato. I had never heard of CSTO before. Would you mind giving us an explanation? What does that refer to?
No, so I first learned about the CSTO only a couple of years ago in college, but it stands for the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is basically a military alliance that Russia founded with several post-Soviet states like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and others to essentially keep them in Russia's security orbit. It's very much functions like NATO in that it's a collective security alliance, meaning an attack. If one country were to fall under attack, then that would trigger other members of the alliance to contribute to their defense. And it's never really been taken seriously as an organization. It's mainly just been a political tool for Russia to keep these countries more dependent on it and in its orbit. But recently in Kazakhstan, they intervened pretty successfully, unfortunately, in shooting dead about 130 people that were protesting against the government because the government increased fuel prices, and the government is not exactly a democracy in Kazakhstan. And it was pretty terrible event.
So this is not any kind of an agreement that could be compared to, say, the Warsaw Pact, as far as, you know, they were all like one kind of, I guess that was the collection for so many years. I grew up under the Cold War of Warsaw Pact versus NATO, you know, and both, there to kind of contain one another. So two quick questions for you then, Roy. First of all, when the Iron Curtain fell, when the Soviet Union fell apart, why didn't the rationale for NATO likewise come apart at that time? Because wasn't their goal to hold back, the Warsaw Pact?
Well, it was, yeah. And I can recall, I believe there were even talks about Russia joining NATO, about Russia becoming either a partner and being put on track for NATO membership, just as to sort of, hash out the last, I guess, great schism within European politics. And NATO didn't really go away. Just because the sort of collective security allowed the European powers to frankly spend money on other things. Most European countries that did not have to deal with a threat didn't actually meet the 2% threshold for defense spending. And so they could pour that money into other sectors, making a stronger economy, investing in infrastructure or any other pet project. So it was really convenient for the European powers, but unfortunately, threats have a way of coming back, and the Baltic states and several of the countries that are closer to Russia, in fact, have actually been consistently meeting that defense expenditure because they have to deal with, well, a rather aggressive neighbor. So NATO still has its uses, but unfortunately, it is even more sorely needed now because of recent Russian aggression.
So how many members are there then in the CSTO at this point? Does it compare in any way with NATO, or is it like a poor man's version of NATO for the Russians?
Not in terms of size. Some members have entered and exited just depending on whether they see the organization will serve their interests or not. Russia generally dominates the organization. It's very much the country that dispatches troops to wherever it's whoever asks for them. The Kazakhstani president Tokayev requested these troops because his security forces were sort of losing control of the situation because people were rioting. But it's not at all comparable to NATO. It is sort of a poor man's NATO. That's a great way to look at it. But there have been several, civil wars and outbreaks of violence in members like Kyrgyzstan in 2010 and Tajikistan as recently as 2021. And the CSTO essentially said, no, we're not going to deal with that. So this quick, speedy intervention in Kazakhstan really took a lot of people by surprise because most people didn't take it at all seriously. So it's definitely, I unfortunately said that it might be a precursor that Putin is more comfortable with using military forces elsewhere. And I don't like to be right 100% of the time, but I kind of wish I was wrong in this scenario.
It's fascinating for me because really while I respect what NATO was doing during the Cold War, I've wondered over the years since then, since the Berlin Wall came down and so forth, whether NATO had outlived its usefulness. And, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment, Roy.
Go for it.
Russia does not like the idea of NATO being expanded to its right to its own national borders. And it seems that to NATO, this is just my opinion, I think they've been kind of tone deaf in hearing Russia's concerns about its national security. Is there a double standard at play here, or can we make the case that, well, NATO can be trusted, but Russia, for these reasons, can't?
No, that's a terrific point. I honestly have struggled with that a lot. The one thing I would say to that is most of these countries aren't being forced to join NATO. They're doing it off of their own free will, state sovereignty. If the people want to vote on NATO ascension, then that's great. They should be able to do that. Putin has said that, they don't want NATO to expand up to its borders, that there was this sort of informal, formal agreement. It's a little murky there. I looked into that a little bit. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union, stated that there was no agreement after the Soviet Union fell that the NATO wouldn't expand. There were some declassified documents that were released that showed in 1997 Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, repeatedly made overtures to President Clinton about, limiting NATO expansion. And Bill Clinton said essentially that, I can't control that. I can't tell another sovereign nation, sorry, you can't join NATO because the Russians said so. And quite frankly, with all the recent events now, NATO's purpose for, Western Europe's security, again, like you said, Western Europe isn't facing any major security threats, but the Baltic states, Norway, Ukraine, all these other people that have to deal with Russian cyber attacks, disinformation. Russia likes to project propaganda to Russian speakers in the Baltic states to sort of undermine trust. I don't even know if I want to go into the whole 2016 controversy, but when folks are having to deal with this aggression, NATO is a lot more prevalent and more useful to them. But no, I completely hear where you're coming from, and most Americans, I think, agree with Donald Trump when he said that, why are we supporting these countries that aren't even meeting their requirements for NATO membership in the first place?
Okay, we got about 1 minute left, Roy. I have to ask you, prognosticate for me. Does NATO continue to expand? Is it likely Ukraine is going to become a part of NATO? Where do you see this going with Russia? Are they likely to pull other countries in, on their behalf?
That's tough. NATO has applied for EU and NATO membership, but with the ongoing war, it's tough to say whether that will happen. I mean, you mentioned that you grew up during the Cold War, and I didn't, but West Germany was a NATO member, even though the Soviets occupied a third of its territory. So NATO isn't sort of a static, opaque organization that, everything's very clear cut for membership. So Ukraine could potentially join. I don't think that right now that would be a smart option because Russia could just escalate the violence even more. And with the sanctions that are now being imposed for Russia, I think you could see more expansion of the CSTO or have them grow closer to China.
Okay. I'm going to link to your article in the show notes here. Again, we are talking with Roy Matthews. He is a contributor for Young Voices. Roy, where can people find you on social media?
Twitter, I am at yaboyroy98 with a Y. That's where I'm most active.
And we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Lillian Tara. She is a Young Voices contributor, and Lily, I would greatly appreciate it if you could tell us just a little bit more about who you are and what makes you tick.
Hi guys, my name is Lillian. I am a student at the University of Virginia studying Chinese and Persian, but I do have a very deep interest in economic and social policy, especially free market oriented policy, and I'm hoping to pursue a career in the think tank community in that domain, possibly academia, and I love talking about these issues.
Well, you're in the right state. If you're looking for some optimism, Virginia turned kind of a nice corner last November when they elected Glenn Youngkin. First of all, give me some ideas. What did that mean for the state of Virginia to elect Youngkin as governor?
I think the first thing that I realized was that it meant people cared about us outside of Virginia. And I really heard mostly about the Youngkin win from other sources outside of the state. And I didn't really realize the depths of this significance in terms of what it means for the Republicans, especially since they haven't won since 2009 statewide. And it's interesting to observe the shifts that have come in Northern Virginia, especially where I was born and raised, because you see this development of the parent-teacher rift, and that's something that's really causing a lot of friction within the political base. And you see the lines being drawn in a way that pits the voters against the state in a pretty unique way, in a sensitive issue, which is our children.
Yeah, I think education was rightly credited as that was the tipping point that brought Youngkin into power. And talk to me about some of the proposals that he has put forth regarding education, and then we can focus in on what you point out may be his most important aspect of education policy.
In all honesty, what I've seen is that the majority of the most highlighted cases where Youngkin has really won the support of parents has been things that are actually fairly superficial, in that you have masks, which may not seem superficial, but relative to content debates, they might be. A lot of revisions, they have the superintendents looking over the different critical race theory biases that are being introduced in curriculum, supposedly, and that also does have its own bit of subjectivity. There was one executive order that referenced an issue in Loudoun County where several key details of a case regarding sexual assault for a student were hidden from the parents. And that was obviously a very emotionally charged one. Those are kind of the main ones. With the pandemic and with critical race theory, I'd say those two are the big ones. But because they're so difficult to address and they're such big issues by design, there's actually not that much that Youngkin can do in that regard without overstepping his boundaries, I think.
So you mentioned in your article that one policy suggestion in particular involves charter schools. Let's flesh that out a little bit. What are these charter schools, and why is this such an important and again far-reaching policy compared to the others?
It's very interesting because on Youngkin's page, when he discusses his issues, there's a couple on education, and at the very bottom of the list, there's invest however many million in charter schools across the state. And to me, this was overwhelmingly the most important thing that he wanted to do. And immediately I can tell this is probably going to be the least popular, at least the most neglected. And I think this is because charter schools are a very long-sighted investment. They set the ground for competition and innovation within the education system in a way that, one, has a lot of enemies to begin with, but two, won't necessarily yield results the way a mandate or an executive order would, or banning mandates. And that, to me, is the issue with a lot of public policy, especially in education, because you have to take a long time to measure the results of any policy. And you have to let these lottery systems work, these students move, the demographics to shift, and you won't see the test scores change immediately. You have to follow these children over the course of however many years. And this is, again, as I said before, an issue that has many, many political enemies. You're essentially fighting against the entire education establishment, many, many unionized teachers whose entire career is guaranteed to them, who are guaranteed to get money as they progress in age, but not necessarily in competence, as some of us may know. And this is something that I think that if parents genuinely want to be involved in the education of their children, they should consider, because the choice that they have and the flexibility that charter schools allow for parents and their kids is really something much bigger than any single mandate that or executive order that Youngkin himself could put in.
So is it safe to say that this would actually allow the people with the most skin in the game, so to speak, to have more say in how they go about educating their kids? Fair enough?
Yes. Well, I think part of the problem is that right now the people with the most skin in the game are the unions and the teachers who have so much political clout. So you could argue that maybe we need to be making it so that parents and their kids have a greater stake in the game, because it seems to be that they're outsourcing the job of education to a group of specialized, licensed professionals who maybe don't know their kids as well as they might.
That's a very good distinction. I appreciate that. And again, this comes back to, why did Youngkin get elected in the first place? I remember there was at least one point where was it McAuliffe who was governor? Talked about, well, parents shouldn't have this say in education. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the rallying cry. That was like, remember the Maine, I mean, people got out and really went to the polls because of that. Now, tell me about some of the hurdles that charter schools face. You mentioned in your article, nearly all of them are political. What do they look like?
I think right off the bat, one of the most obvious ones is that to establish a charter school, you would need permission from the very school district that you're trying to compete against. And obviously, by definition, that's just not going to happen. And you see this, you see this in that charter schools get results. And so they're a threat to the current system, and anyone whose livelihood is tied up with the current education system, the teachers, the administrators, the bureaucrats involved, they're going to be resistant. And we've seen this where a lot of the anti-charter school research that has been done by very vested interests in the education system. And I think it's not an emotional enough issue that parents will rally around in a way that would provoke actual change. And I think the biggest issue is just showing that this is a viable alternative, which maybe isn't as heated as we would like it to be to generate that kind of result, but nudging people towards that direction.
Do you foresee that the developments of charter schools, or continued success among charter schools for that matter, could this open the door to even more discussion about I got to choose my words carefully because these could be trigger words for, like, teachers union members, privatizing larger portions of the school system, separating school and state? Is that too extreme, or does any of that ever come up in discussion?
That's something I absolutely advocate for, but you're right in that you have to be careful, because immediately the first charge that you get is, oh, well, you care about profit more about our own children, or can you put a price on the education of our future generations? And so I think the issue is that you have to, especially when you're addressing more emotional parents and teachers, put the emphasis on the needs of the children, right? Like, we really are trying to think of the children, and it just so happens that a system that is more adaptable to their needs, that actually lets teachers discipline more, or lets teachers be sorted out by competence in a way that the current system doesn't. These are things that will ultimately benefit the children, and that is the emotional issue that really people need to get ourselves geared towards for people who may use emotional arguments as a counterpoint.
Now, I've heard the saying, you've probably heard this too, one of the battle cries for advocates of reform in education is fund the students, not the systems. Does that carry any weight with you?
Absolutely. It's a bit of a free market truism and a school choice truism, but absolutely holds up, because you really start to lose sight of the individual students when you're looking at the education system as one massive system that perfectly serves to take inputs of children and mold them into adequate citizens. And I think anyone who has passed through the public education system knows this not to be the case. And so once we view the individual results, we hold ourselves very, very accountable to the students who we see that we're failing. On a personal level, we know we're failing, but we kind of forget when we're looking at broad-based social policy.
Okay. Well, I love your article. Again, this is published in Roanoke.com. We will include a link in the show notes. And your point is well taken. There are some very sensational topics out there that are sure, crowd generators and attention grabbers, but they may not have the kind of lasting impact that this particular policy with the charter schools would have. Where can people access your writings? Where can they find you on social media?
I am in the process of making more social media. You can find me on Twitter, which I believe is Lil Tara _X. And I will continue to be writing. I'll hopefully be at Cato this summer, and I will be more involved in that community as well.
Okay, so Lil Tara, Tara. Just want to make sure we got the spelling.
_X.
_X. Okay. Lillian Tara, thank you so much for being on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Great to meet you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you as well. Have a great day.
Welcome back. This is our final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. And we are happy to welcome Daniel J. Smith. We'll call him Dan. He is joining us as a contributor to Young Voices. And Dan, tell us just a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate you having me on. I'm a professor of economics at Middle Tennessee State University and the director of the Political Economy Research Institute. So we focus on, studying the relationship between market economies and the human well-being. So that's what I'm doing. We write op-eds. We do research that has actual practical policy relevance, and we try to add to discussions going on in current policy debates.
Well, we've got a fun policy to discuss here, and this is actually a topic that has come up a couple of different times through various Young Voices contributors, and that is there is kind of a regulatory campaign, I would say war, but that phrase is kind of spoken for right now in other areas, but against vaping. And I was surprised to see your article on Real Clear Policy that talks about tobacco's surprising partners in stubbing out vaping. And I would love for you to put some skin on that for us and help us understand tobacco. Now, are they involved in trying to help vaping or to get their competitors, out of the picture?
Well, it's a little complicated when you unpack it. But the main gist of what's going on is tobacco companies see vaping as a threat to their bottom line. And so rather than trying to adjust their production methods, try to meet the changing preferences of consumers that are more concerned about, switching to a relatively safer product, what they're doing is trying to find ways to hamper access to electronic cigarettes through government regulatory agencies.
Okay. I'm not trying to recommend vaping as, it's like health food or something, but I do know a number of friends who have been longtime smokers, and that was the bridge that they could walk over to get away from smoking and actually wean themselves, from smoking entirely. So I'm not trying to present it as a panacea, but I've seen with my own eyes that for some people that is kind of a neat option.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the crux of the argument against vaping comes from is that regulatory agencies are looking at vaping products and saying, well, those aren't entirely safe. Well, neither are a lot of products that we already consume: ribeye, steaks, scotch, cigarettes, traditional cigarettes.
Basically, so the good things in life.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And what you really have to look at is relatively. Are they relatively a safer product than conventional tobacco? And the absolute answer is yes, from all the medical evidence we've seen, that if you switch to vaping, that you're far likelier to avoid some of the worst negative health consequences that come from smoking traditional tobacco. And the question is, do we want to offer that option to consumers, or do we want to prevent consumers from having access to a healthier option and live in kind of a Pollyannish world where we just assume, well, people just quit smoking? Well, they're not quitting smoking, so let's at least have this other option that's relatively safer available for them.
Talk to me about how Big Tobacco, which is very heavily regulated, has learned to work with and perhaps even influence and maybe nudge those regulatory powers.
Yeah, so Big Tobacco has a long history of working with government regulatory bodies. It's known in the economics literature as regulatory capture, and that's a big fancy word for just meaning that the regulated industry gets embedded with the regulators, and this happens through a couple different ways. For the Center for Tobacco Products, one of the ways that they're embedded with tobacco industry is that they're entirely funded by a tax on tobacco products. So if in fact, consumers do switch en masse to vaping products, they would actually lose funding for their own jobs. Another way that they're embedded, that the regulated industries such as tobacco get embedded with regulators is by offering jobs to the regulators after they are done with their government gigs. So it's very common for them to say, hey, you're regulating us today, and then, by the way, we have this job coming up in a couple of years that would be perfect for someone like you. It pays really well. It's a consulting job. So it's a way for them to kind of wink, promise a job in return for ensuring that the regulation is enacted in a way that at least benefits, to the extent possible, the regulated industry.
Now, some people would see that, well, if they're very heavily regulated, they must be at a terrible disadvantage. Talk to me about the major advantages that Big Tobacco enjoys because of this relationship with the regulators. How does this help them against their competitors?
Yeah, so the main way is that they're able to use their financial clout and relationships with the regulators to prevent new vaping products from being approved. So there's been a huge onerous regulatory process that's been in place for any new electronic cigarettes being approved. It's costing lots of money and lots of time, and very few approvals are coming through. The regulations seem to change, on an ad hoc basis. It's very confusing and complex for these companies to get their products on the shelf for consumers that actually want to consume vaping products. Lo and behold, the two of the vaping companies that are owned, at least in part, by Big Tobacco have received regulatory approval, but all the other ones have found it really hard to get past that regulatory barrier.
Imagine that. how
exactly what you would expect.
What a coincidence, yes. So where does this go from here? Do the vaping companies have to learn to play the game and become more involved with lobbyists and the workings of the system, or is there the possibility for a separation from Big Tobacco and those regulators? I don't see the regulatory state paring itself back anytime soon. Do you?
No, I definitely don't, and unfortunately, the we look at history in other industries is when new industries are at this point, they oftentimes just jump in the lobbying game, and now they're going to hire a lobbying firm on K Street, and they're going to pay their political dues to the political elites, and then they're going to get their regulatory favors eventually. But of course, that's not ideal. What we'd really like to see is regulators get out of bed, so to speak, with Big Tobacco, and especially eliminate some of this unnecessary regulation that is clearly benefiting big tobacco companies and disadvantaging vaping companies. It's clear cronyism at play right now, and to the extent that we could just eliminate that, consumers would be better off in the long run.
So, does it look like there's ever going to be a time where adults will be allowed to be adults again, or is the regulatory apparatus pretty much with us to stay?
Yeah, it's kind of nice to imagine a world where adults are free to make their own decisions as long as they don't infringe upon the rights of other people. And that's exactly what I think this should be. I think we should leave this in the hands of consumers. The evidence is out there. People can see the evidence. You've seen it with your own eyes anecdotally. The empirical studies are out there. Allow them to sift through the evidence, even in consultation with their physicians, and make the appropriate choice that is right for their own circumstances. Government should not be involved in that decision, especially a government that's being bought out by big tobacco companies.
No, good point. Now, just to put some skin on this too, again, in the idea of how big is big tobacco. When we talk about the kinds of revenues that they're enjoying, even though I know smoking has been on the outs for some time, it's no longer glorified in movies and so forth. You can hardly find a place to do it publicly anymore. But there's still a lot of money at stake, isn't there? I mean, what kind of revenues are they looking at?
Yeah, so what's at stake is a lot of money in revenues. It's enough that it justifies spending over about $20 million in lobbying expenditures just in 2021. And that's actually fallen down from the heyday of big tobacco. And then they registered around $3 million in campaign donations in the same year. So that they're clearly defending a huge, stock of revenues that they've generated, and they want to protect that against at all costs. So whenever they drive down the road and see a tobacco shop is now a tobacco and vaping shop, that hurts them in their bottom line, and they're really concerned about it, and they're doing everything possible, including engaging in explicit cronyism to prevent that from happening.
All right, we got about 1 minute left here. Just one quick question. Do the vaping companies, do they still catch a lot of heat for promoting their product to kids? I know for a while that was the concern, Joe Camel's, to get kids to smoke, but do the vaping companies face that same kind of accusation?
Yeah, I think that's one of the other arguments that people make against vaping companies is, well, what these get in the hands of children. But of course, traditional cigarettes are getting in the hands of children as well. And we need to do everything possible to ensure that this product is only available for adults. But I think that can equally apply to conventional cigarettes and vaping. And it doesn't privilege one or the other. And it certainly doesn't justify privileging one or the other in the terms of government regulatory power.
Okay, again, we are talking with Daniel J. Smith, the director of Policy Economic Research Institute at Middle Tennessee State University, as well as a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you, either online or on social media?
Yeah, the easiest way is at SmithDanJ1 on Twitter, or you can just Google Daniel Smith at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'll pop up. I have a website, but I'm happy to interact with anyone out there that wants to follow up with me.
Okay, thanks for being on the show today.
Of course, it was a pleasure.